First of all, welcome, and I'm very happy that we could catch up after our work society symposium. And the idea, I mean, we are joined by several participants from our ongoing MOOC, the Massive Online Open Course on Technology at Work. And the idea was to have, I mean, some conversations with people who are actually professionally busy in the field, and also some foresight experience. So I might now just give a quick introduction to the discussion, to the conversation. But the idea is to just open up the conversation and see wherever it brings us. And also I will loop in then different questions from the participants themselves, if that's fine for you.
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. So, quick intro also for the other participants. Welcome not only to our MOOC, but also towards, let's say, the future of work dialogue that we're starting to have. I'm just going to try to loop in also my screen here for the time being. Just give me a sec, because I think we are seeing your, that's fine. Okay, so this part of the dialogues is part of the, what we would call as a kind of indirect contribution to the Future of Work Centenary initiative launched by our Director General, Guy Ryder, and which actually is expected to define how the UN Labour Agency will realize its mandate on social justice as it enters the next century in 2019, as we enter also the fourth industrial revolutions. And this dialogue already started 2 years ago. Over the past 2 years, I think in more than 110 countries, national dialogues were held in 4 major areas in how the current discussion is structured. In work and society, which we had actually a global conversation weeks ago on that one, on decent jobs for all, on the organization of work and production, and last but not least on the governance of work. And also recently, a global high-level global commission on the future of work was appointed and actually launched this proper summer. And the global commission is led by the Prime Minister of Sweden and then the President of Mauritius. And they will actually prepare a seminal report to the ILO Centenary Conference in 2019. And of course, what is the training center as ours is doing there? We basically support the capacity building arm of it. We actually support dialogues globally on these particular themes with a focus on facilitation, training and knowledge management on the initiative. Before I continue, may I ask the other participants just to mute their microphone, because I can hear some people talking in the background. You just click on the microphone next to your, and then it should be muted automatically. I'll try to do this here because I have a control as a organizer, so now everybody is muted. So if you want to take the floor later on, you just have to unmute your microphone. Now for the discussion, Morné, there's a lot of, I mean, these 4 angles, they're both, let's say, thematic entry points with so many questions. We had only on the first discussion on work and society. Just a reminder for participants, please just unmute your microphone because it's getting in. Okay, good. So Morné, what I wanted to ask you is, first of all, if you could give a quick introduction of yourself, who you are and what you do in South Africa at the Stellenbosch University as an entry point, and maybe some personal reflections just to kickstart. And then after that, there's many questions that we could go in on the 4 different teams. And recently just had a 2-day dialogue on work and society where we reflected fundamentally about what is the place of work in our global society. And one of the nice ideas that I have heard from you is that also in our Technology at Work MOOC, we're so overwhelmed and immersed with technology. And one of your statements was, actually, it is the time to be human again. It was one of your let's say, mark points that really triggered my attention, specifically in an area where the entire discussion is actually determined by technology. And that is a kind of a voice that I don't see here often in, let's say, newspapers and dialogues or anything. Everything is much more focused on the automation, digitization, robotization, and so on. So I won't speak too much. That's why I said it's a conversation. It's based on questions. So I'll hand over the floor to you. I would like to repeat for the other participants, please try to mute your phone, because otherwise we hear too much noise in the background. I'll just mute because there was somebody coming in, I don't know from where. So Morné, if you can unmute your phone right now and just introduce yourself, and we can start with the conversation.
Thank you very much, Tom, and it's great to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation and for the colleagues joining us online. Yeah, I'm Morné Mostert. I'm the Director of the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University, which is in South Africa. It is the first and remains the only Institute for Futures Research on the African continent, and our view is really that with the future of work, there's a re-emergence in a curiosity about what the future might hold for work. So I was privileged to be part of Tom's session in Turin a few weeks ago, and it was a really fundamental revisit on the future of work, guided by Tom, and really we revisited, as I suggested, even the most fundamental ideas, such as what is work. I will respond just very briefly to the idea you raised, Tom, of my observation that I think perhaps what we're entering is the era of humanity, and perhaps I could just give my main argument for that. Since the first industrial revolution, the dominant paradigm has been an admiration of the machine. So when we discover technology, we have a kind of adoration, some would say even a holy submission to the technology. And that gives the technology, of course, a certain kind of status in the society. Now, obviously, the solution is not to fight the technology. But what's interesting is since that first industrial revolution, a lot of the paradigm has been around the question, how can we get humans to mimic the machine? And we see it in the usage of language. In the English language, for example, it's a great compliment if you can say someone works like a machine. You can say even someone is a machine. You can say a team works like a well-oiled machine. If something goes wrong, you know, there's a spanner in the works. If things are going well, they're on track. If they're not going well, they're off track, and things are picking up steam and so on. In other words, the technology has become the dominant model for what we think work is. We're entering a time now where I think very excitingly, for the first time, we are realizing that there is work that machines can do that humans simply cannot do. And now, on the one hand, that's a little bit daunting because, of course, we're nervous about the loss of jobs. But on the other, in a certain sense, this is a celebration because we are finally realizing that humans should not mimic machines. They should, in fact, behave like humans. And so I think one of the opportunities of the future of work is that we're entering an opportunity, particularly from a research perspective, which I would say because I'm based at the university, that we should actually be studying what it is to work as a human, as opposed to studying how we can get humans to mimic what machines can do. And in that sense, I think there are enormous opportunities in the future of work, but I look forward to an engagement with our colleagues.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Morné, for these introduction reflections. I'll react on one or two of them to then continue the conversation. But at the meantime, I also open immediately the floor for our colleagues that are following online. There is a chat box which you will find under, and if you send a message to everyone, there is the possibility to ask a question to Morné on, let's say, the initial reflection. So I'm monitoring it, and I'll loop in the questions as they as they come. One reaction that I have more on what you was mentioning, I read this book here, it's called The Second Machine Age of Work Progress and Prosperity in a Time of Brilliant Technologies. And there also, it starts maybe even with that simple story of Garry Kasparov that basically mentioned of, you know, his chess example that in 1982, or I don't know the date anymore, it was with Deep Blue, who basically through artificial intelligence beat actually any human chess player. So that was a kind of tragedy announcement of we will be replaced by the robots and so on. But his reflections right now are completely different. If he looks back at the example right now, he says, like, look, the combination of the machine and its artificial intelligence actually driven by the core characteristics of what it is to be human, the creativity and things, that type of combination is unbeatable, is something that we have not seen actually before. So I was wondering that kind of complementarity story of what Garry Kasparov in chess was meaning, does that have any potential in how we would think about our future collaboration with a more, you know, it's a different notion. That is one reflection. A second reflection, as you introduced it, yeah, we're coming into a new time, you said. Is there really a kind of a paradigmatic shift? This is also a question that I would like to elaborate a little bit further, and how do we have to position ourselves in that, because what I see still a lot in the debate is kind of dichotomous, you know, it's the robots versus the humans. And the complexity of the world of work where we are today in actually is much more difficult to grasp than just putting these dichotomies into place. Oh, there's someone unmuting the microphone there. Okay, so just two reflections that I got of that Second Machine Age book that connect pretty well with your introduction reflections. Could we have some feedback on that from you?
Yes, I think it's a very interesting observation, and that chess game became the kind of ultimate symbol, because it really was about humans versus technology. And the paradigm that we're moving into now, as you're suggesting, is humans in association with technology. In other words, it underlines my earlier idea that we should give up the fight, that humans should combat technology. The question is, how are they better integrated? And the truth is, I'm really not sure that we know. If you understand the idea that smartphones even really gained mass adoption around 2008, 2009, only about eight years ago or so, it feels to most of us as if these things have been around forever. So actually, it's a very short period in our history where we've had the kind of pervasive technology that means that we are connected to everyone on the planet all of the time, and we have artificial intelligence that we carry around with us all the time. So I really, to be honest, don't think we've actually done very good research to think about what it might mean for the species. So I think on the idea of competition, it might be possible to argue in favor of some competition if you think about particularly human traits. But again, I think we have to spend a bit more time thinking about what those are. That paradigm shift, therefore, is really one that we know will have very significant implications. I think that the big shift is moving away from this idea that we can somehow fight technology and towards the idea of embracing two things. One, what does make us uniquely human, and perhaps there's some competitive advantage there. And two, not just how do we kind of tolerate the technology, but in fact, how do we think of technology that is kind of something that is pervasive in our society, may in fact make our lives better. Of course, the argument isn't nearly that simple, because there are certain people in certain jobs who have a very real threat from technology, and I don't think we should ignore that. But I'm really just arguing that the idea of how do we fight the technology is that's the wrong fight.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I'm getting already some questions in which I'm paraphrasing right now. One reflection is with focusing again on what is uniquely human, is basically widening up the debate again, and it's not just exclusively driven with this kind of technological deterministic view. It's widening it up. That is someone noting. So if we have to widen the debate up with that kind of perspective, do we also need to widen it up towards, let's say, a larger audience? Because they are currently making a video of our work in Symposium Society, where you and several other people say, like, look, it's time to break up the discussion. You mentioned a pentagonal discussion or something. Maybe if you could explain what you mean by that pentagonal discussion. But one of the reflections was indeed, you know, we need to move beyond our traditional dialogue partners. And maybe if you could respond to that question in that way.
Yes, the pentagonal model was really my response to the tripartite model in which business, labor, and government come together to resolve matters. And of course, it's a very sensitive matter, and whenever models broaden, there's a little bit of a risk for the elements in the current model to feel that their power may be somehow diluted. But let me just explain the model anyway. So in the current tripartite model of business, labor, and government, the idea is that there is sufficient representation there to initiate ideas that would in fact lead us into a world in collaboration with technology that maybe won't be that different from the one we've had before, where that tripartite model was absolutely suitable. But one of the questions is and this is particularly true in certain developing nations, and I of course sit in a developing nation, one of the questions is, are citizens in fact very well represented in that model? And in theory, you could argue, yes, of course, governments are democratically elected, they represent citizens, people work in organizations, that's often business, so they're represented there, and labor, of course, represents people who, who are employed. But consider, for example, who represents people who are not employed? Mm-hmm. Who is the main lobby group for that? And so one of the implications is, could we extend that tripartite dialogue to include a much more active and explicit representation from citizen groups? Call it civil society if you like, but that's perhaps such a broad term that it's perhaps too broad. But could citizens be represented somehow in addition to the representation that they get in government, in labor, and in business? Because there's a growing dissatisfaction in many developing countries that perhaps citizens are not as well represented as they could be. And then the fifth pillar that I proposed in that pentagonal model is that of academia. Now, of course, you might say I would suggest that because I sit at the university, but I must just tell you that the work we do here is mainly with business and with other large organizations, including membership organizations. And the argument in favor of introducing academia there, and of course there's a lot of debate in academia also, it's not to suggest academia is a homogeneous body, but we are entering a new era. That means we need new knowledge. Now, where in the society do you have the entity that represents the search for new knowledge? And I would say the answer to that is in academia. So academia supposedly presents also a neutral playing field, does objective research as far as objectivity is possible for anybody, but is certainly non-partisan. So a pentagonal model in which you have business, labor, government, a greater representation from citizens, and a much more explicit representation from academia may be one way that can guide us forward.
Mm-hmm. That's, as someone is confirming here also in the chat box, what you mentioned there is actually directly towards our third dialogue on the governance of work and on the representation of it. And this is something, at least out of our previous workshop, 5 times came out, that we probably will have to think in different ways of representation and maybe come up also with different models of engagement and dialogue. And that is one of the things that we would like to feed in other discussions as well. Now, quick question maybe that I can link towards the academic or the role of academia in it. And may I ask just, again, the participants just to mute your phones, because I hear myself double now, so I'll try to mute everything. Okay. What is referring to Moore's law of exponential growth, and that was also reflected in the book. They said, like, look, the speed of that technological change is exponential, doubles every 2 years, and maybe a bit slower right now. But if you look at that kind of exponential growth, it reaches levels of, let's say, how would I call it, magnitude that are practically impossible to understand with, let's say, the human brain. We talk about, like, say, figures that are perfectly unimaginable. And that's where I was referring earlier onwards also. Do we have, let's say, the adopted language to talk about these kind of new evolutions that we don't grasp at scale, where academia can research into it and the implications on all of it? So the question is here, there's so many things specifically in technological evolutions that we not fully can grasp with our full mind. We probably need an augmented mind to understand the full consequences out of that. And that's, I don't know, where can we get support to engage in a meaningful dialogue to see all the consequences through, specifically if we're going to talk about a whole series of new topics like artificial intelligence, just as one of it. And are we equipped enough and skilled enough to have, let's say, again, if we put the human dimension into the discussion, if we put the ethical or the social dimension into the discussion, are we equipped to discuss these matters without fully understanding the full picture? This is one additional reflection that I would like to play back to you.
Tom, I think that's a really crucial question. If we believe that things are changing all the time, and if we accept the premise that the pace of change is accelerating, then it must mean that there will be exponential results. Now, if we then say we're entering a new era which requires a new paradigm, let's ask a very practical question. Which one in the current tripartite structure studies the nature of paradigms? Business, government, or labor? And I would very humbly submit that not one of them does that. And that's because that's not what they do. Business behaves in a certain way towards certain objectives. Governments, if they're democratically elected, work towards, of course, the strengthening of the citizenry, but they're also in a political game. Labor has a certain mandate, but Labor's main responsibility is not the discovery of new knowledge. The only place where you find that in a society is in universities. Now, of course, business spends a lot of money on research, but that research is applied to that specific business and its business imperatives. Government spends a lot of money on research, but a disproportionate amount of that number goes to the delivery of very basic services, and some of it goes to the study of political competition. So the best place where this new knowledge, if we accept we are entering a new era that requires new knowledge and requires new paradigms, where will that be studied? Well, countries already have universities. That's the perfect place for it.
Okay. Thanks a lot. So also the future of work is not only a kind of questioning the identity of the International Labour Organization, but also for universities, it's a kind of soul-searching function of what you can mean in a society. Because and we will share the video afterwards, where one of your final conclusions in a video that we found, said, like, anything what we reflect about work is indirectly a reflection on how we see society. And that might be also, and I'm just repeating the question for participants. I got already some questions through the private chat. I invite everybody to contribute, and I'm getting questions in, and the next one that is coming in is that the future evolution of humanity, what evolutionary nature presses for, is an awakening to the knowledge of self, the discovery of self, the manifestation of self and spirit within us, and the release of its self-knowledge, it's self-power, it's native self-instrumentation. The question stops, or the remark stops. It's more a kind of a thought, and I would say even almost a spiritual thought that comes in. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Norm, or if it's just a statement or a thought that comes in.
Well, I think it's a very interesting idea. You know, what is the nature of self in a time where for hundreds of years now we've tried to surrender the self to copy the technology. So I think it's a very deeply philosophical observation, but I think a very relevant one. And what might the nature of the self be in a time where we accept that we are in fact not machines? How will our sense of ourselves differ? I think that's a lovely thing to explore.
Mm-hmm. And it comes back also, again, to your starting question of what makes us uniquely human. And this might be, that's why like the first work and society discussion, it was kind of interesting to see that this was the discussion where the organization or where the different partners had most difficulties with, because when you try to dive into that question, you dive into maybe 15 why questions, and it goes really into a kind of an existential mode. And that's where also, let's say, a lot of people had, like we talk about a lot of different directions, and we are a little bit disoriented and confused sometimes when we dive into that discussion.
But Tom, you know, if I can respond to that, I think that's okay, because you know, again, this is so recent in our evolution as a species that I think it would be really false to pretend that we now know the answers. I think a much more informed approach is to say, what are some of the key questions that we need some answers on? Because that, I think, makes for a much more informed kind of debate. Of course, there's the reality of work and results and people having to make a living, if not to earn a living, which of course is already a debate. Should people just make a living, or should they earn a living? But I think that it's important that we identify some key questions for us. Now, just imagine this. Just imagine that we come to a time of technology and the first question we ask about what it means to be human, we get stuck. What does that tell us about what we've been studying for all these hundreds of years? So I think it's exciting that we get stuck, because it's showing us up as a species. In a way, it shows us we've been studying the wrong thing.
And maybe we have been distracted too much with technology in one way or another.
I think so, and that trend, of course, is increasing, but I think there is a counterforce emerging that says, you know, don't forget the humans. And the humans, and I think we should move beyond a kind of primitive notion that humans should be protected. They should be, I think, understood and find a healthy place in the ecosystem of society, rather than some protectionist preservation for humans in society, you know, beyond which technology has the run of the place.
I'm getting another question inside here. Said like, okay, can I ask participants just to mute their phones again? The question is as following: in the MOOC, we're exploring a whole diversity of themes. Now, also only in the few questions that we have already addressed, there's so many different dimensions to tackle. And we had already referred to one of the books that tackles the more technological question. Do you have some recommendations in other authors or books that highlight some of the insights that you were basically saying? So for further food for thought, do you have some inspirations or some suggestions to make for the participants here?
Well, you're giving me an opportunity to, I really cannot refuse to talk about our own publications here, Tom. We publish an annual publication called Business Futures, and we've done that since 1976. And people are welcome to go onto the Institute for Futures Research website and have a look at some of the documents there. But you know, my encouragement actually would be to, for the purpose of this debate, to not just study the nature of technology. In other words, there are all sorts of books on technology that is available, but I think we're seeing a kind of a re-emergence. So if I may make a practical suggestion, issues around systems thinking, around sociology and anthropology, I think those fields of study are making a re-emergence. We're realizing the importance of really understanding what it's like to be in a healthy ecosystem, not just environmentally speaking, but an ecosystem in which you find humans and robots, for example. That kind of ecological thinking. And system thinking is a great way of helping to understand that. I can send some of the participants a list of reading if they like, but there's particularly interesting work done by Capra, Fritjof Capra, and also by Ackoff, Russell Ackoff, John Pudner, and a number of others. You know, not to turn it into an academic conversation too much, but I can provide a little list.
Yeah, but even with the overall umbrella of, you said, system thinking or complexity adaptive thinking, both approaches or way of thinking or way of studying, bringing back to the table that the reality is interlinked, is highly complex, that we cannot have, you know, say, a mono view on these things. Just let me mute everybody again. Okay, and that might be already a way to have, again, conversations in a much more profound way that reflect the reality as it is, and sometimes that we are missing in the debate. Actually tomorrow we're starting a new future of work debate with journalists, exactly on the same debate, because if you look in media, it really tackles only one of the dimensions of this future of work debate. It's very much technologically oriented, and we were looking now for different angles. How can these other angles be incorporated into the discussion? There's another question coming in, and it's about technology again. Sorry about that, but and it's related to one of the core, let's say, constituents of the ILO. And you made a reference towards unions, and this is coming from Sim or Simel, and she says, like, well, do you think there is an issue to promote technological evolution? Because what the experience is in a lot of things is that there's a big resistance, that it's almost seen as a kind of a threat, that it's always highlighted in a more negative side. Could you frame that kind of, when we refer to the unions, is that resound, or do you understand that?
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense to me, but what I would say is that we don't have to worry about the promotion of technology. Think about, you know, when we discovered the bicycle, you didn't have to promote the bicycle. It was obvious, yeah? When we discovered the train, you didn't have to sell people the idea of going on a train or a car. I mean, I know there's a lot of promotion of the smartphone, but you know, if you look at the advertising, and this is where I think the media conversation could be really fascinating, and the relationship between media and advertising, but if you look at advertising of smartphones, I mean, the adverts are really based on the qualities of being human. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that you can't have a strategy that says, well, we're not going to promote technology, because technology will promote itself. So you don't have to worry about whether you're going to promote it or not. It's going to be promoted anyway. Another very important idea is that business has a kind of DNA, you know. I don't think it is as simple as labor unions often sketch it, but they have a view on the world. And efficiency is very often a part of a complex mix in business. And so when technology presents efficiency options, the default for business is going to be to embrace that. So, you know, whether you promote it or not, that's going to happen anyway. Will it help if you oppose it? Well, I don't think so, because, you know, it's just the classic opposition of technology that we've seen for a few hundred years. Does it pose a real threat to jobs? I think in certain instances, it absolutely does do that. But to consider the level of promotion, I think, may be the wrong fight to have.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot for this. There's another question coming in, and with all these developments that you're now sketching, and bringing in a question that we answered 2 weeks ago, is like, the question is, do we have to work? Is there really a need to work? And this question is coming in from Bianca from Spain. I think she says, like, many constitutions include the right to work. For example, the Spanish Constitution, Article 35, said all Spaniards have the duty to work and the right to work. And should we think about changing also constitutions to adapt them in lines of today's evolutions and developments, or is that something that we just can keep as it is? That's a question coming from Spain.
It's a massive question, and again, I think it depends on what you mean by work. So one of the debates is, could we conceive of work as the idea in which you make a contribution to society? Is that what we mean by work? Another question might be, is work simply a means of, creating a decent life for yourself? That's another way in which we can perhaps define work. A third definition is becoming increasingly unpalatable to most of us, which is that work is essentially the willingness, to serve a master in exchange for a modest kind of remuneration. I think we're all agreeing that there's a growing dissatisfaction with that third definition. But those first two, the work as the ability to serve, or the opportunity to serve, and perhaps even obligation to serve society, and work as the right to earn a living, I think those two are going to be around for a while. And the two are splitting a little bit because we're noticing that, perhaps in certain areas, work is not a meaningless kind of work that is not decent, let's say, may in fact not be required at a future horizon to meet your basic needs. And that is where some of the opportunities of the technology lies. But if we remove the opportunity to work in order to earn a living, if we take that second definition, if we remove that opportunity, that doesn't mean there will necessarily be an opportunity to serve society through other means. And that's where I think governments have to be a lot more creative, and that's where I think they should talk to citizens and talk to universities more.
Okay. Thanks for that. That was also mentioned very carefully, that the diversity of interpretations of work is currently not incorporated in our way of talking about work, and that's still some work to do about that, to say it in that way. And also double checking the time and opening up for another round of questions, or more, if you think that there are questions that we have not addressed so far, feel also free to put them on the table. And just double checking here the chat box, and I don't see any new questions at this stage coming in. I'm leaving it open for a few seconds. Please feel free to just ask any related question, as it's a conversation. We're with quite a lot of participants already on the webinar, so please feel free to intervene.
So I think one of the interesting opportunities for citizens that may be emerging from this conversation is, how are citizens holding their governments accountable for their ability to anticipate? In other words, this is beyond just, general governance of countries and, the removal of corruption and so on. How can citizens hold their governments accountable for what you might call their futures projects, their long-term, long-range projects? And I think this is a new era of kind of active citizenry that we might see. Because as the window of the future and of predictability is foreshortening, in other words, we're able to predict less and less, I think citizens are going to place a greater pressure on their governments to talk about how countries are going to be sustained in the long term. And so this has very serious implications for many political systems where, for example, leaders are elected for 4 to 5 years, let's say. And we're already starting to see some of the negative implications of these 4 to 5 year cycles, where people come into power, they usurp as much of the power as they can. There are often problems that are created for the long term with certain short-term benefits. But there's very little thinking in much of politics about what the long-term future of a country might be, and I think citizens are going to increase their pressure there.
And with the long-term view, we also come towards one of the specializations of your university, the foresight. In our course and also in different other models, we have tried to introduce people to say this kind of foresight methodology and foresight way of dialoguing opens up the way for long-term thinking. Could you say a bit more what Stellenbosch University is doing to stimulate that debate on the long term, and what kind of tools and methodologies we could equip not only citizens but every one of us to get engaged into that more long-term perspective?
I think the way that we go about doing things is that we have a formal postgraduate program. So there's an academic program, it's postgraduate only, masters and PhD. But most of our work, as I said, is actually with organizations, much of it with business. And there we look at national futures, in our case South African futures, but we also look at African futures. This is a recent product that we've developed, something that looks at the future of the continent of Africa. And of course, I know the focus of our conversation now is not Africa, but the future of Africa has an enormous fascination for us. You know, the demographics are absolutely fascinating, literacy levels are rising, internet penetration is absolutely enormous, even financial transactions online are growing at an absolutely exponential rate. Civil wars are coming down, health issues are being addressed, dictators are having shorter and shorter periods as democracy rises, and so on and so on. So there's a whole host of fascinating things happening in the future of Africa. And then we study that continental future at the hand of a few themes. And one of the first ones there is what we call the art and science of decision making. And so our target audience is typically senior people, senior decision makers. And even though you can argue in favor of working with much younger people for the future, our reasoning behind working with senior people is that they have decision-making authority over resources that will have multi-decadal implications. So that art and science of decision-making, how do we in fact make a high-quality decision that is cognizant of the future, is a very important theme. And one of the very important principles there is our advice to senior executives is that decisions must be made not only not based on the past, not only not for the present, not only for the future, but indeed based on the future. A futures-based approach to decision-making, which sounds a little bit odd, and certainly I have this debate often with some of my academic colleagues who say, you know, what's the source data? Then our standard argument there is the source data is the future. Because if the future is the only place that you could possibly go, you better make your decisions based on that future, because it's the only place you're going. There are a number of other themes that inform what we do here in the African continent. Social matters are also important. We're seeing the re-emergence of that in the rest of the world, with Trump and with Brexit, and with Western Europe having their own kind of social dynamics challenges. But social cohesion particularly is a relevant issue for us, in addition to the quality of leadership here in Africa. In addition to the social matters, which also includes education, we look at matters of security in a few ways. There's a cyber security dimension, there's a crime and security dimension, and there's also general social security dimension. So we examine what those futures might look like. And then we look at a few other themes, including matters of technology, which are perhaps very obvious, but then also issues around innovation, and how innovation has the potential to create what we call options for alternative futures. And so we are engaged in some national dialogues. We write commissioned pieces of research for organizations, and we also publish some of our own research as a sort of agent provocateur in society, just to get the debate going. But I think that's a very exciting opportunity for universities. We have a neutral mandate. We just want to learn more. And we have the opportunity as universities to create convening spaces where business, government, labor, and civil society can come together and engage in some of these big questions, which is, I think a responsibility not enough universities are taking on, but certainly we're taking it very seriously.
Yeah, when referring to the African continent was interesting because when we talk about future and foresight, everybody's always aligning with the 2030 or something just by saying something with the SDGs. But I think Africa was the only continent, whether it was the African Union, who put 2065 somewhere as a kind of. So they must already been infused by foresight at Stellenbosch University.
I'm sure that's the main reason. Yes, the people online can go and have a look at Agenda 2063. Agenda 2063. I think it's a very important model, thinking at a very what we call a Pan-Africanist way across the 54 African countries, in a way that really thinks about the long-term future of the continent. Yes.
Yeah, and this is also what we hope to bring with these dialogue, all interventions that we do at the training center here, because our first impression was that dialogues about the future start already with, you know, not the real future, but what we are currently already doing and just amplifying it towards the day after. And in order to come up with some more radical thinking, some more ideas that bring us out of the comfort zone to be prepared for the challenges of the future, we probably need different dialogue methods, and that's why we really get into this foresight story, and we hope that we can continue after this webinar also to exchange on these type of methodologies that you're using at Stellenbosch University, because here at the training center it's highly appreciated. At this stage there are 4 academies on social protection, on green jobs, on migration, and on social and solidarity academy that actively make use of foresight as a conversational tool with all constituents and beyond, and that has given us interesting, let's say, results that widen up the debate, the dialogue, and this is definitely something we will continue.
Fantastic.
Good. We're almost at the end of this, let's say, conversation webinar. I'm just going to open up for 2 final questions before we move towards the concluding reflection. One is, I'll put them both on your pane. One is coming from Spain. EU Pillar of Social Rights say that young people have the right to continued education. Is the EU not aware of its aging population and the need for long-term learning? That is one remark. And then there's a participant, Melka Matula, who wants to go back to the concept of work, which is very basic. She says, I think an appreciation of work that goes beyond looking at it as a commodity, but as a way for a person to develop and to contribute to society will change the way business treat workers and their compensation. That's she just puts in it as a comment. So if you would like to react on these 2 final thoughts, then we are almost ready.
Perhaps on the issue of the EU pillar on social rights for young people to have a right to continued education. I think what might help there is that we should move away from the distinction between work and education. Mm-hmm. I think in the future it's already starting to happen, but you know, what is work and what is learning? The distinction is blurring. In other words, we no longer have sort of blocks for learning and blocks for work, especially not in a linear kind of time phrase. You know, that you learn when you're young and you work when you're old. I think that is changing very quickly. And then on the nature, the very nature of work, I think the idea that organizations have workers, if you just think about the language, as if they somehow possess them, I hope that we will have some interesting work that revisits that idea, that workers are still seen to some large degree as somehow belonging to an organization. I think that relationship has the opportunity to evolve in a much more sophisticated way.
Okay, so I'll take the hybrid integration of learning and working. So it's not only lifelong learning, but also lifelong working, with the aging population to also add on that. And maybe some new, let's say, language or terminologies might capture that better, instead again of working with dichotomies or just spreading one or the other. So maybe it's an invitation for all the participants who participate with the MOOC to upcome with some new language that incorporates these new evolutions in the world of work and learning. So good. Thanks a lot, Morné. I don't think we have any questions anymore. What we will do is come up with a kind of synthetic overview of the many reflection points that you have shared. If we could get from you maybe some additional literature that is worthwhile exploring, and we're taking on, let's say, the invitation to explore the publications that your institute has done to it, because they might also generate additional conversations in the MOOC that is currently going on. Thanks a lot for taking the time to be with us. We definitely continue the conversation, and also after this we will send you a video which was a recap of our previous symposium, where you can see some of your own reflections into an audiovisual language. So thanks a lot, Morné, and thanks for all the participants who were here today with us. The conversation has started. We have about 10 upcoming webinars with other experts on the field, so I think it's going to be a continuous dialogue which will feed into the larger discussion. So thanks and bye for now.
Thank you so much for hosting this important discussion. Thank you.
Thanks.